The 2026 stimulus texts are here. The time has arrived where the College Board has released the stimulus text for the year. And so this video is going to be diving into what these texts are, exploring some of the themes, and then going through each text and unpacking some of the most important points, as well as really situating this in the scheme of the larger IWA project. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we can dive into the sources, we really first have to understand how these sources fit into the IWA and then the larger different attempts and performance tasks that fit into this course's architecture. So let's first talk about what we've done up to this point. Up to this point, you should have completed the IRR and the TMP, and so the stimulus texts are really the first step in getting ready for the individual written argument, or IWA. Now, the individual argument, the IWA and the IMP, unlike the IRR and TMP, there's not a team element here. So this is completely on the individual student to end up picking a topic that is using and inspired by the themes from the stimulus text. So let's try and make sense of how that works. Well, visually, I've got up here sort of how the College Board expects you to go from stimulus texts all the way to unique student paper and presentation. So the first step in that is the stimulus text. Each year the College Board provides 7 sources. These can range from research articles to photographs. There's even been videos in some years. And each of these articles have a lot of themes in them, but they also have a shared theme that unites them. And this is really what the students are after as they unpack these texts. So as they move forward through these stimulus sources, they're looking to pull out a shared theme, and then inspired by this theme, not about this theme, but they will write a research question that is inspired by this theme. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that process works at the end of the video, but once they have a research question, they will then go on and write their argument paper, not in dissimilar ways to the way they've written other papers, including the IRR. They're gonna have to go gather other resources, but this time it's inspired by what was in the stimulus text, and they have to use a source effectively from the stimulus text. I always tell my students to use at least 2 sources so that they have more chances at bat of incorporating these sources effectively. Then once they've put together their essay, which argues a solution to a problem or some way of thinking that should be changed around a issue, then they will have the IMP. And unlike the TMP, where they were coming up with sort of a unique solution that drawed on the knowledge that they gathered in their reports, the IMP in many ways is just a presentation version of the paper. So that's more or less how these stimulus sources both fit into the larger architecture of the course, but more importantly, how they are the foundation of launching the students into their IWAs. All right, so let's dive in and talk a little bit about the 2026 stimulus pack. We're dealing with 7 sources here, a range of articles. We've got research articles, we've got some photo sets, as well as some reports, and even some interesting short stories here. So we're gonna dive in and tackle these one by one. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in with our first text. The first text is a text, it's a research article called Exploring the Role of the Coffee Shop in Urban Lives. And I have to say, this is one of my favorites. Right away, this source introduces us to this idea of the third place, which is more and more something that I'm seeing come up even in my own conversations in life. But this really leans on the urban sociologist Oldenburg, who talks about a third place being sort of this place that is not home or work, but a public place in which communities, identities, and individuals mix and construct their identities and things like this. And so these researchers are immediately sort of framing their study of coffee shops in this context. But a little more details, these three researchers are from the UK, and what they're essentially doing in terms of their methodology here is they're choosing 5 cities in the UK. They're looking at 50 different coffee shops, and as they visit, they're conducting interviews as well as making observations. In total, they conduct about 100 interviews. They talk to baristas, customers, the owners, and this is the data that they're then basing their findings and conclusions on. And so, why does this matter? Well, right at the beginning of the article, they really explain that coffee shops have what they call a ubiquitous presence in urban areas, and that coffee shops have been found to play various roles in the communities far beyond just a caffeine fix or a small business. They say that coffee shops constitute the very heart of urbanism today. And for someone who lives in a large city and loves to spend time in coffee shops, immediately I'm sort of tracking with what they're saying about coffee shops' role of community building. And they say that increasingly it's important because of how isolated urban lives are and the modern life is in general. Here are some of the key findings that you can find them pulling out of their data based on these interviews. Firstly, they find that modern coffee shops function as third places that can bridge social capital by connecting people not just at home and not just at work. So these are third places for building connections. Secondly, they find that coffee shops, they have organized activities that foster interaction, whether these are readings or co-working or art events. Thirdly, they find that coffee shops, they allow a co-creation between the business and the customers. So it's not just the business that is driving this community building, but it's really this exchange that is dynamic between customer and owner. Or another thing that they say here is that there's often sort of weak ties that get built with coffee shops and a sense of community over time. So one way that people in urban environments start to feel connected to their neighborhood or to their cities is by frequenting these coffee shops. So they say that plays a really important role in that connectedness. And then they also talk about how coffee shops, they have lots of roles, and it's not just this community building they're setting up, but they talk about how they are also workplaces that are beyond the home or the office, as well as places where people actually might seek some solitude or rest. Lastly, they do acknowledge that coffee shops, while there's a lot of positives that they've identified in their research, they can also contribute to exclusion and gentrification based on their cost, the clientele, their location. And so we see that coffee shops in urban lives do also sort of reflect back the tensions that exist in urban places. You can sort of imagine the researchers talking about how a once working class neighborhood that is undergoing gentrification, those original residents may actually look to the coffee shop as evidence of a neighborhood that they no longer feel familiar or included in if this coffee shop is catering to, let's say, more affluent or more newcomers. So all of this together leads the researchers to a really important conclusion. They argue that coffee shops are more than just a place to buy coffee, but these are places that foster community and allow customers, individuals, who live in this increasingly isolated urban environment to find personal connection either with a community, with one another, or with some larger thing outside themselves that is not impacted by work or home. So again, that third place idea is really important here. Ultimately, a really interesting article. I think there's a lot of themes that you can see in here emerge. I'm thinking places like, or themes like third places, community, urban life, consumer culture, isolation, public spaces, even gentrification. So one thing that I like to do with my students is immediately tease out these possible roles. And if you would like to see how I tackle this, I do have a link in the bio that has links to all the curriculum I use as I walk my students through this. It includes the handouts, the slides, some of these questions, and places to do some of the unpacking after each of these sources. So that is the first source. 1 down, 6 to go. That first source, exploring the role of the coffee shop in urban lives. This second source is called Our Epidemic with Loneliness and Isolation. This is a U.S. Surgeon General report from 2023. This is just jam-packed with statistics, and when I read this the first time, I immediately saw so many potential paper topics that are emerging from this. This source neatly categorizes some of the different impacts that stem from lacking social connection. This report more or less pulls from a bunch of different reports over the last couple years that talk about how loneliness and isolation is becoming an epidemic in our society, and that it's not just an epidemic that impacts mental health, but there's implications on physical health as well. And so this source is really good at nailing some of those down. Now, one of the first things I do with my students is we just open straight to that first page where it talks about how lacking social connection is as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than smoking 15 cigarettes every day. And then more dangerous than drinking 6 alcoholic drinks daily. And so really right away I ask my students to think like, okay, why might lacking social connection be as dangerous as these tried and true factors for poor health outcomes? And that's really what this source is all about, is answering those questions. And so there are 6 key areas in which they talk about some of the connections between loneliness and isolation with health outcomes. And I'll put those connections on the screen, but it is impacts on cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, infectious diseases, cognitive function, depression, and anxiety. So these are the big 6 that they focus on in the article. And then they also explain in the article sort of how does social connection play into processes like biology and psychology and behaviors, and all of this ends up impacting health outcomes. Now, they cover a lot of ground there in mental, physical, cognitive health. And so halfway through the article, they sort of talk about how all of these different pathways impact someone's health outcome and ultimately their premature mortality and morbidity. This source here is just a real sobering and useful look at how social isolation has grave consequences, and that managing some of these health outcomes actually may be done through social connection, through community, rather than necessarily through medicine or other more typically medical interventions. And so this source here, it's really concrete, offers a lot of statistics that students may be able to use in a variety of papers. And so I really like to use this one to springboard students into thinking about potential topics that they could use these statistics or these themes about. So for example, I talk to my students about, hey, when it gets time to write your IWA, you might want to write something about teenage mental health. Maybe your paper is about how online gaming communities are these sort of digital third spaces that allows teenage boys to tackle the loneliness epidemic. This is a great opportunity to start students to start thinking about their research questions that might shape their IWA. All right, so that's the Surgeon General's report on our epidemic with loneliness and isolation. Our third source here is by an environmental journalist by the name of Ben Goldfarb. Now, Goldfarb writes an article here that is sort of an abbreviation of a book he wrote. This article is originally found in the Smithsonian, and the article is called How Roads Have Transformed the Natural World. And this really takes an ecological perspective at roads. And so let's dive in and get to some of the meaning here. One of the most important parts of the text that helps us understand what Goldfarb is trying to explain is he opens by saying that roads are logistical essentials and cultural artifacts. They epitomize freedom and they are the architecture of our restlessness. Now, he makes the argument that roads constructions do tell us important things about what societies value. And some of the things that it can tell us is that while roads are essential to modern life, he does want us to look at some of the negative impacts. So his main argument essentially here is that while roads are essential, they have profoundly changed the natural world by fragmenting habitats, killing wildlife, spreading invasive species, accelerating climate change, and all these effects that demand serious scientific attention and more sustainable solutions through what he calls road ecology. So he really wants us to take a critical look at the role of roads in nature. And he does this by really walking us through 4 claims that build his argument. The first of these claims that he gets into in the article is that roads are the leading direct human cause of land-based vertebrate death, and this is now surpassing the effect of hunting. And so roads, we can understand, cause massive wildlife mortality, as well as they chop up and fragment the habitats that animals depend on. He also goes beyond this to say, beyond the road danger, sort of crossing the road or right on the side of the road, roads often have wider road effect zones. They have disruptions on ecosystems by spreading pollution, the way the water runs off the pavement, or sort of dividing hunting grounds. They can even cause disease or introduce invasive species. So he wants to really paint a picture in his first 2 claims that roads have a significant impact on our natural environment. He sort of zooms out from here and talks about how global road expansion, developing, especially in developing regions, is threatening our habitats and increasing climate change. And these new roads are also helping speed up resource extraction. He talks about the roads that sort of wind and crisscross through the Amazon and other remote places that now enable extraction of resources. From here, he talks about how there is scientists talking about this. He talks about how there's an emerging field of road ecology, which he's definitely participating in this article, that this new road ecology research shows that these harms are not inevitable and that there are solutions. And if we design and construct our infrastructure in roads with these external problems in mind, that we can mitigate some of their harms. And so right away, you sort of get a sense of him having a solution to a problem, which I think is really helpful, especially as we're thinking about the IWA. This is an argument he's making. The problem here being sort of everything from wildlife, roadkill, all the way to ecological harm. And he does offer some concrete solutions. Things like crossings, right? Strips of land that allow animals to cross, or tunnels that allow wildlife to pass underneath infrastructure. And he gives plenty of examples here that really illustrate what he's trying to show. And these are examples that I would show the students pictures so that they can see themselves what Goldfarb is getting at here. So in conclusion, this is a really interesting piece, sort of like an op-ed that is part of a larger book. It's really adapted for this article size. But in this, environmental journalist Ben Goldfarb, he is arguing that while essential, roads cause widespread harm that is often overlooked, but that through the field of road ecology and intentional design, we can mitigate some of these effects. All right, and now on to our 4th stimulus source. We're almost halfway done. This source is, I have to say, my favorite. It's a short story from the famous Japanese author Haruki Murakami, and this story is called A Walk to Kobe. Now, this is a story in which he's recalling a visit home, And packed into this story as he walks through a city that used to be his home is a lot of philosophical wonderings. He has this very interesting way of describing details and exploring his internal monologue as he walks through this town. I like to open by asking students to reflect on one of his quotes, where he talks about no matter how far you travel, you can never get away from yourself. So beyond just being about a visit home, this story is really about his own internal reflection on this idea of home. At its core, A Walk to Kobe is a story about loss, memory, and an uneasy relationship that exists between our personal identity and physical place. He returns to Kobe, which was the site of a huge earthquake in 1995 that devastated this city and caused a lot of things to be rebuilt. And so as he goes back and takes this long walk, he is sort of seeing that the landscape is no longer matching his memories. And through this process, he's confronting both how he has changed, but also how his city has changed in irreversible ways. The essay itself offers a couple vignettes where that kind of spur this reflection. One of these first ones, he talks about sort of walking down, and he should know the individual streets, but he can't quite recall them. And here's what he has to say. He says, the reason he couldn't recall them becomes clear. Places that used to be empty lots weren't empty anymore, and places that hadn't been empty now were, like photo negatives and positives replacing each other. In most cases, the former were empty lots that were now residencies, and the latter were old houses been destroyed in the earthquake. These before and after images had a synergistic effect, adding a fictitious wash to my memories of how the town once stood. In going back, he paints this vivid picture of how there's a conflict between his personal memories and the way the landscape itself has changed. There's even a scene where he's kind of comes out looking at the sea, and he says it's like a perfect day, people are grilling, and yet in the middle of this scene that he describes as almost perfect, he says it feels like a tire losing its air, and that he can't help but have this sense of violence. Now, the violence he's referring to here is not just the violence from the earthquake that had actually made way for these physical transformations he's experiencing, but even more significantly is the internal feelings he's feeling. The landscape no longer matches his memories, and he is forced to confront how things have changed. And this process of change, loss of personal memory, and loss of connection to a place speaks to how not just natural disasters and urban development can sever emotional connections, but that our movement through time can feel as violent as an earthquake in shaking our sense of personal connection to place. And it's such a beautiful idea here that he speaks on in regards to personal connection and time, and this idea of how returning home places can shape and mold in terms of their significance. And so this story is about much more than a walk through his hometown and how the town has rebuilt after an earthquake, but it's really a story that talks about how we can have our connections with places severed, and that this severing of connections can be difficult, and it can be hard for us to accept. But nonetheless, this essay suggests that returning home is not going to restore the past. Places will change. Even if those places physically stay the same, as we change, we may feel connections that are different to these places. Really an awesome opportunity here to talk about themes with students. There's a lot of themes that come here. It's a very symbolic journey, his walk. And so one thing I love to do is, as they're reading, we often read in a circle, taking turns. Students are jotting down themes that show up on sticky notes, and we're putting those on the board and discussing those afterwards. Stimulus number 5. This is an article published by the Associated Press called 35 Years After the Berlin Wall Opened, Fragments of East Germany's Border Remain. Now, this is an article that's pretty short. Really, the meat of this text is the pictures, just a really beautiful photo set by Marcus Schreiber of sort of the remnants of the Berlin Wall here. Now, in order to understand this text, you do have to understand some of the context of the Berlin Wall. Now, famously, the Berlin Wall was a physical wall that ran through Berlin, separating East and West Berlin. This wall emerged right at the end of World War II as the Soviet army came in from the east and the Allies from the west. Germany was divided in half and administered and managed by both the USSR, the Russians, in East Germany, and then in the West by the Allied powers. And very soon from the start, there were starkly different realities in East and West Germany and East and West Berlin. And the Berlin Wall was a physical divider, which Berliners were not allowed to cross. People could even be shot or captured in attempting to. And so the Berlin Wall stood as a physical reminder of this restriction of movement. And ultimately, towards the end of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall really helped signify the final collapse of the USSR as they started to lose some of their satellite control of countries throughout Europe. Now, students may or may not have this context, so it's important to show pictures, movies, and talk a little bit about the Berlin Wall. Without this context, it's really hard to understand the significance of this photo set here. When we look at this source, one thing that may seem surprising is if this wall really did represent so much oppression and repression, why are so many fragments of it still remaining? And answering this question is really central to understanding these images and ultimately what this source is trying to get at. So today you can see in these pictures, I'll put some up on the screen, that these sections of the walls largely have changed in meaning dramatically. You can see lots of examples of street art, people gathering at these places to admire the art, to reflect on the history. And then there's other pictures that sort of speak to the Berlin Wall's remaining in the background in understated ways, like this picture of sections of the wall next to a cemetery, or sections of the wall next to a closed property. And then there's that lovely picture at the end that shows sort of on the street there are scars, there are marks of the history that once defined this city, and we can still walk in those physical places and be connected to the past. And here we can see a really beautiful selection that talks about our connection to place and how this connection changes, the significance of that wall and what it would have meant to a Berlin resident when there was a division versus what it means now as they sort of hang out, maybe graffiti it or admire the street art. Is just night and day. And so I really like what this source has to say in terms of its touching on themes related to connection and place, related to remembrance and history. And one thing that I invite my students to do with this source is, since there is images that are so rich with ideas and sort of creative implications, when I look at this source, I also invite my students to create a piece of creative fiction that is inspired. So a poem or a fictional journal entry, maybe how a person may experience this wall, if that lived once when it was a wall that divided the city, things like this. And if you're interested in taking a look at more of these materials and how I do these lessons, these are all ready to go, slides, handouts, you can check it out. There's a link in the bio. But that is essentially the 5th article. It's more or less a photo set with some accompanying text 35 years after the Berlin Wall opened. All right, we've made it to source number 6, just 2 more to go. This source is called Dad, Ballpark Will Live On in Shared Memories. This is a beautiful story written by the journalist Anne Killian. And in this story, she is reflecting on her father, her memories of him, and his love of watching baseball at a specific park, the Candlestick Park. And this story really weaves the memories of her father with the memories of this baseball park. So she memorializes both of them. Her father has recently passed away, we learned, as well as this park is set to be demolished. So in this way, we can see this idea of emotional connection to a place and memory being connected and refracted by physical place. And so there's a lot of rich connections here, both with other texts and within the article itself. There's places to connect personally. This article opens with her sort of talking about memories of her dad, him carrying a transistor radio, listening to baseball, enjoying eating the peanuts, her spending time with her father. And we really get this picture of her really cherishing the memories of her deceased father. And the Candlestick Park, although yes, it's what is probably relevant to the audience that is reading it, because more of them have memories to Candlestick Park and then obviously connections to her father. She really just uses this place as a way to refract her memory of her father. And so this is a really touching and thoughtful exploration of how place and person can become intertwined, and how our emotional connection to place is individual and can transcend what the place itself represents. This is not a story really about baseball as much as it is about remembrance and emotional connection to place. Last but not least, we end the packet, source number 7, with somewhat of a doozer, a really dense research article, but one in which, explained well enough, can be really interesting to students. And I feel like I left with a lot of questions and a lot of learnings from this. So I'm talking about the final article, Sustainability Assessment of Low Earth Orbit Satellite Broadband Megaconstellations. I'm going to be completely honest, I had to do a little bit of research ahead of time to understand what exactly we're talking about here. But essentially, this is an article about the increasing use of satellites in the low orbit around the Earth that are being used for connectivity. I think one of the most famous ones that is in this article and that students may be familiar with is Elon Musk's Starlink. And so essentially, let me break it down how this is working. SpaceX, the company, is launching these satellites into the low orbit, and with enough of these satellites in orbit, they can provide internet, satellite services to even really remote communities. And so the article talks a lot about how this is a really effective way of connecting communities that would be often outside the reach of other broadband connections, other accesses to internet, telecommunications. But this article is also really trying to highlight the sustainability dynamic here. And they are making a pretty clear argument here that there is a problem that is being somewhat ignored, and that is this is just really emissions intensive. think about it. There are rockets being launched into space, and these rockets are setting off a lot of CO2 emissions. You may have seen a picture of the launch. You can see the smoke billowing. And in order to really get all of these satellites into orbit, it takes a lot of investment. And this investment comes with an ecological and environmental cost. And so this article is really asking students to reflect on this, because it's not just SpaceX who is sending these satellites into orbit, but Amazon has started doing so, as well as another European company, EU Telesat. And so together we are talking about thousands of low orbit satellites in the night sky, and they refer to these as megaconstellations. And there's some really interesting images. I'm going to put some up here where you can see it's like a web crisscrossing and absolutely covering our Earth. Now, this is a pretty dense article, and this may seem sacrilegious for some of you and maybe some of my scientists who are watching this, but I like to give my class an edited version of this text that really is like the abstract, some images, some key passages. And this edited version excludes the complex technical data. It doesn't go into depth about the methodology and limitations and such, which I think are interesting, especially if you're working in a sort of STEM-focused AP seminar course. But for my intents and purposes, I thought that students could really get to the meat of it, find connections, and connect it to other sources better if I gave them a truncated version. And then those who choose to use it, I obviously encourage to dive deeper. If you want to see that abbreviated version, like I've mentioned previously in the video, I do have lessons that have all the materials and handouts that I use as I move through these sources. All right, so when I introduce this, spend about half the class, a little more just going over the truncated version of this article. But this is also a really important moment with your class to start to think about what are the connections between all 7 sources. And that's what we're going to talk about in the last portion of this video. All right, we've looked at all 7 sources. So what do we think it is? What is the central theme that thematically unites all 7 sources? There are so many themes packed into these 7 diverse sources. You can let me know what you think in the comments. I personally, right away jumping out to me is this idea of connection and connection to place. You do see that in all 7 of our sources. The first source, we're talking about how coffee shops function as sort of these third places where people can feel connected and build community. And then we talk about the loneliness and isolation epidemic. So we look at how the lack of connection and social interaction can have really grave consequences. In number 3, we talk about roads, this sort of physical phenomena that explains our connection to nature, and as well as our relationship with animals and the natural world, and talks about sort of how we have sort of this responsibility. In number 4, we have a really interesting musing through Murakami's walk to his hometown about how our connection to place can change, and how over time this sense of connection can be difficult to grapple with those changes, and how physical place itself can also change how we connect to places. And then number 5, we have this photo set that looks at the Berlin Wall 35 years after, and how these remaining slabs of concrete help us connect to the past, help us reflect, and really are ways in which the city of Berlin can talk about its past, and in doing so become gathering places for new stories to be told and new ideas of community and connection that are sort of allowed and made possible by the remaining physical artifacts of the wall. In source number 6, We see this beautiful memorial to her father through telling us the story of Candlestick Park. And in this way, we see place and personal connection just beautifully intertwined as she remembers both of these things. And then last but not least, when we're talking about the sustainability of these low Earth orbit satellites, these mega constellations that are increasingly covering the globe, we see that both like sort of connecting faraway disparate places are enabled by this, but even in our connection, similar to how kind of roads connect us, there is these questions of our responsibility and what are the costs of our connections in terms of the place and space it occupies. So just so many potential IWA papers that can emerge from this. But once I finish moving through these stimulus sources, I usually take it day by day with my students. I immediately want to launch them into thinking about their own IWA topics. I have a worksheet on that last day that we talk about, okay, I give them a topic and say, which of these two sources would you use in that paper? And be able to explain how you might use it. And that's ultimately where we want to end here. Once students have unpacked each of these texts, they should get a sense of how they could use any of these texts in their own paper. The next step is going to be having the students actually figure out what is the topic and what is that problem and solution they're going to be arguing about. And they have to make sure that that thing they choose to look at can effectively incorporate two or one of these sources. So that's the 2026 stimulus text. I appreciate you for taking the time to watch this video. And if you would like to support the work I do, I have materials to help you go through these stimulus texts with your students, but I also have materials that can help you go through the entire year. So do please head over to my Teachers Pay Teachers, and I appreciate any of the support that you're willing to give. Feel free to give it a like. And subscribe to my channel here, where I'll be periodically uploading more videos about AP Seminar as well as AP Research. Take care and best of luck. May you find connection to the places that are important to you in your own life.